Okay, Judy. This is two holistic psychiatrists talking. This is our 8th episode, and this is our first episode live. And we are 15 minutes late because we've been starting this conversation unintentionally on my personal page. So it just shows you we're still learning. And if anyone's still there listening, we apologize for the delay. And we will go back and repeat what we just talked about so we can have this be complete for anyone that might pick up the conversation later after it'll stay on there after it's been live. So today's conversation is about racism and social justice, and I'm going to read an introduction that'll lead us into the conversation, and I'm reading it so I make sure to hit on all the points that I hope we can touch on. But the full title is Racism and Social Justice, Shifting a Culture of Passivity, Avoidance and Fear to Responsibility, Compassion and Courage, starting with ourselves. So we're not sociologists, and Judy, you and I have both been socialized in a white culture, which I think we would both agree is a racist system. But as psychiatrists, we do have an understanding about the unconscious and about denial and avoidance and shame, which are all pillars of maintaining a racist system. So this conversation is for those who are wanting to be part of addressing the ongoing racism, injustice, and inequality in our country. And we're generally, I would say, talking to white people primarily because the idea of racism is a white person's problem in the way that we're talking about it. So we hope anyone listening and really hope to help each other think about how to broach this painful reality in ourselves and in our country, and how we can all take steps to find our role in doing something about it. So for Judy and I, this is one of those starting places for us. So the 5 areas that we're going to talk about are self-awareness, listening and learning with humility, compassion, taking action and speaking up, and courage. And then we hope from there we can talk about a couple of examples or questions if there are any. So Judy, why don't we talk about this idea of self-awareness, because I think it's going to be not just a superficial self-awareness, but this is like a deep, painful reckoning. Right. Self-awareness.
It's not the kind of thing that we like to think about ourselves. Like, it's not the way that we want to see ourselves. And it's way too easy to say, I'm not racist, but we've all been conditioned by the culture in which we grew up, which is a racist culture. And so we're unavoidably influenced unconsciously by so many assumptions and realities. We were talking about before, I think it's different now for kids than when I grew up, because there is a lot more consciousness raising and diversity training and inclusion training than anything that I had as a kid, even though I would not say that I grew up in a particularly racist family, although it was, I think, just unconsciously so. But I was just saying about how in the crayon box, the crayon for flesh was like beige, and it never occurred to me until much later that that was really strange, because flesh isn't naturally beige, it's many different colors.
Right.
That's just sort of a quintessential example of just a very subtle, not subtle, but kind of embedded reality.
Right, and multiplied through and through by. So someone could really identify themselves as being very progressive and being very open-minded and not having any racist biases. And inevitably, we're all shaped in some way by our schooling. Even
The media.
the media, the news stories that are picked out to be, put into the news, like all of those messages, there's like not a way around it. So it's not like anyone, if anyone thinks they've kind of come out of that, growing up in this country, and I would even argue that I think today kids still are getting these messages, even if they're getting
But it's better than
their
it was.
February of sort of inserting diversity and African American history once a month, as if that's going to like cover bases.
But it is different. It is different. It's not. I'm not saying that there's not a problem.
Yeah. But it's an attempt to
beginning to
right.
And it's certainly. What goes on in Newton, Massachusetts, is not what goes on in many parts of the country.
Sure. Mm-hmm. And I guess what I'd like to read, I think, is a quote just to speak to this idea of how defensive people can be about this idea of their own biases and unawareness of their participation in a racist system. Is a quote by the woman that wrote White Fragility. She's a sociologist. Let's see. Oh, now I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to find it. I don't think I can find it. Maybe I'll find it later. Anyway, she's someone that did diversity training for corporations, and just repeatedly she was finding so much defensiveness in people, and it really made her wonder, like, why is this like something that can't even be talked about? We know that as psychiatrists, like if the resistance is so high,
the shame, right?
The shame, when there's something there, there's something, be it guilt, shame, or knowing that something's not right and not wanting to acknowledge it. So this idea of self-awareness, I think, is as painful as it is. You can't make strides in this area without that uncomfortable awareness.
Right. And to have a big humility about it being a work in progress.
Right. I don't think it ends.
No. A constant effort to become more conscious.
Right. Because even we still are getting, it's not like we just shift our awareness and move on. We continuously get bombarded with messages that, even the media literacy and all this kind of education, there's still an undercurrent where it requires a vigilance, I think. What are your thoughts about, you brought up the idea of shame and even guilt. So, like, what would you think, like, people might feel guilty or have shame about?
Well, it's not our ego ideal. It's not the way that we want to see ourselves. We have values that, we want to be. Many people want to be, a supporter of justice and of fairness and of equality and humanity, and like those are all like ideals and ways that we wish to see ourselves. And when you're falling short of those, and there's all of these unconscious biases that are um, making it so that you're not living up to the way you want to think of yourself. And
Right.
shame. And there's also tons of guilt about your privilege and how different things are for you and how terrible things are for other people. Um, that there's so much unfairness,
Mm-hmm.
and that, um, like, how do you address it, and that you're like not doing enough to, and that if you're in some kind of way um, contributing to the problem by your complacency or avoidance, it's not a good feeling.
Right. So then it sort of leads to more, it can lead to more avoidance because it's uncomfortable and it's painful. So it's just
And too big.
go there. Mm-hmm. Um, and two, I think sometimes there's a guilt of not, there can be a guilt of not doing anything about it.
Mm-hmm.
Like if we acknowledge that there's a problem,
Right.
then that can lead to speaking up, doing something about it, doing what we can to make things better. Whereas if we don't, then it's easier for people to avoid or not take responsibility.
Right. And there also can be the worry that when you do something, it's like so inadequate that it's just kind of like trying to make yourself feel better. That it's not really addressing the problem
Right.
in a more effective or powerful way.
Right. And I mean, that's why I think this self-reflection and digging down deep is essential. Like if you really want to address it in a powerful way, you've got to clear away. I mean, not that we ever completely clear things away, but that you've got to get down to like the truth and the reality of what's been going on and how collectively we participate.
Right, and not to let the shame and guilt paralyze you.
Right. And two, this idea of, I think because the idea of racism has become so black and white in terms of you're either racist or you're not racist. So we have an idea of people that are racist being a certain way, and that's not us. So we're not that, so we're done.
Right, we're good people.
So, right. So as opposed to that whole spectrum of people that are participating by not by just passively standing by, not doing anything, or organizationally or in groups, where there's inequality and things being said that are insensitive and nobody's stopping to create change.
Right. And I find myself as I'm listening to you just like sort of itching to say that I drove down Washington Street and there were all of these protesters who had signs that said Black Lives Matter, and they were all white, because Newton is not a very diverse community. And it's like you can't sit with how painful the whole thing is. You want to just like fix it and say that it's better. And it is, there are better things, but it's very hard to sit with how difficult the whole situation is. And it's something that has been going on for centuries in this country.
Right.
The country is founded on slavery and, treating the indigenous people like non-humans. And so there's just very root and heart of things. There's a huge, huge problem.
And I think the other I was thinking about how, like, people are, in a lot of ways, are coming to terms with a lot of truths that they weren't necessarily taught. Like, they're learning about what corporations do and about the food industry and about toxicity. And do you know what I mean? There's all this, like, people are learning things aren't as they thought. But this idea,
very distressing.
right. And it's like an awakening, and in this regard, with racism, it's similar, with the exception of, as whites, we've benefited from it. Do you know what I mean? So there's an awakening of, this has been going on and this has been awful. And at some level, we've known it's been going on. And collectively as whites, we've benefited from the situation. So
in some ways of just the abuse and misuse of the environment, that we also benefit in some way through our comfort and lifestyle, and convenience. And these are all very uncomfortable realities to sit with.
Mm-hmm. So I haven't read the book White Fragility, but I've listened to the author DiAngelo, Dr. Robin DiAngelo, I think her name's Robin. She has a lot of information on her website. She has this book, and she's really interesting to listen to. She's a great speaker. But I would say that's a good starting place for anyone that's wanting to really be thinking consciously about these things, and as a resource, because obviously we're not going to be able to, cover all the ground in terms of self-reflection. The next piece would be this idea of listening and learning with humility. And part of self-awareness is that humility of, like, realizing, like, we don't know what the Black experience really is. We can't assume we know that. We don't even know really history that well in terms of the Black experience, because that's not what we were taught. I think our education, and, like, we are limited. And I think whether it be entering into a conversation or however, we have to come into it with that humility of, I don't know. I want to learn.
Right. And that the way that you do that is by, when you do talk with someone, that there's something called active listening. And that's a way of listening where you're really focused and really paying attention to what the other person is saying. And so you're not, like, thinking while they're talking about how you want to, like, the rebuttal or the response, that you're just, like, kind of staying with them and hearing what they're saying. So that's one focus of it, is attention, this, like, really focused attention when you're listening.
Mm-hmm.
And another part of active listening is your attitude. Like, you need to not, like, go into, even though it's hard, like, when somebody has an opinion that, like, you so disagree with, but if you're trying to listen to them and you just, like, a priori think that what they're saying is ridiculous and absurd, you can't really listen. You need to have, like, try to cultivate an open-minded attitude while you listen.
Right, be curious, like, really
curious. Like, why are they saying that? Like, what makes them say that? And what is their evidence, and where are they coming from? And to ask them, to really want to know. And then also to have the capacity to be surprised, and to not have, like, a foregone conclusion before you've heard them out, so that you can be flexible in your listening.
right.
These are all ways that you can learn,
And
because you
if
change
you're,
by how you're listening.
right. And if you come in with a defensiveness because you haven't done your self-examination and you come in with defensiveness, then there's no listening.
No.
You know, there's going to be, how can I prove that I'm not racist, or how can I
Right.
prove that I'm
This is
open-minded?
you know, that I don't have this, you have it, you know. That's not
And
going to get.
are you thinking of like a conversation with someone who's racist or someone that's Black?
I'm thinking of a situation in my practice recently, which has just been really remarkable. The times, I've never, in more than 30 years of practice, had the political be so much a part of the conversation in the office. Like, there can be the craziest stuff going on in the world, and people just talk about their personal problems, but not really now so much. So, very recently, a young man from a liberal family on the coast told me a story about his cousin who was from the Bible Belt, who he had been very close to growing up, and that this cousin had recently posted on Facebook that the George Floyd video was a hoax, and that he had been just so upset by that post and felt that he needed to say something, but he didn't really know what to do or how to say something about it. How to, like, he couldn't just not say anything.
Right.
And he didn't want to do it on Facebook because he didn't want it to be like a public thing like that, but he couldn't just remain silent. So, I mean, it's just interesting. Like, he hasn't had the conversation yet, but I imagine that part of it would need to be something like, well, what do you mean it's a hoax? Like, what's a hoax, and what evidence do you have that it's a hoax, and what makes you think that? But I mean, even before that, he'll need to kind of get clear about his own anger and his own racism, so that he needs to bring down his anger before he can have a good conversation with his cousin.
Right.
Because
Right.
when you're mad, it's really hard to think clearly.
Right. You know, I'm not speaking specifically about this patient, but I think for all of us, if we're getting energized about someone else's racism, it can be, I mean, obviously it should bring anger and rage, but if someone hasn't done their own work to recognize that their own participation, I think out of that work comes a more fortitude in being able to handle all these types of stepping forth, speaking up, navigating, which we'll talk about, you know.
Yeah.
Because it almost makes me wonder, you know, what about like the conversation with someone that's had the Black experience? Like listening deeply and understanding that experience, to not even that it directly informs us what to do in those other situations or what directs us to do in activism, but it just is necessary because we just don't know. I mean, I can't claim to have that knowledge. I mean, not like I feel like I should. You know, even as psychiatrists and with all our training, we did not, I mean, I can speak for myself, did not get training in the area of racism.
No. No. I mean, that's changing now. I know that that's changing now, that for the curriculum is different than when we were in training,
Mm-hmm.
at least
Yeah,
in the institutions that I'm affiliated with, that they do have some
right.
more awareness about social and cultural biases and racism. But you can have all the kind of training,
All the training, right.
and it's still like very deeply unconsciously embedded.
Mm-hmm. Um, this idea of listening and learning, I thought we could talk about like ways that conversation can be shut down.
Mm.
You know, like when people say, you know, that they're so sure they're not racist that they're quick to prove they're not racist, and that can shut down a conversation. So there's no listening. It's a little bit like gaslighting in relationships. Do you know
Yeah,
what I mean?
yeah,
When
yeah,
somebody's doing something hurtful, and then if they're called on it, so to speak, then it's turned around as, I'm not the problem, you're the problem for thinking I'm the problem.
right, 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 right.
um, I'm trying to, when I listen to this particular um, sociologist, she gave 3 examples. And they were, you know, like when people say, I have neighbors or I have relatives who are Black, or I was, do you know what I mean?
Black, but they're
What's that?
black, but they're nice.
Right, or anything to prove that we, you know, that we know, and it's not, you know,
That
we're not
that
this.
that they're so knowledgeable because they have a black friend, or
Right, right. So they're done.
uh,
No need to listen and learn, and
mhm,
um,
mhm.
so and then I think the next 3 areas, which are we're going to talk about, are compassion and um, you know, not being passive, taking action, speaking up, and then courage. And I think without the first 2, those become almost impossible. Like we can only have compassion if we really have cleared away some of that defensiveness
Yeah,
and listened well.
yeah,
Um, I mean, you and I know as psychiatrists that like empathy and compassion can come from someone's capacity for that can come from early life experiences. Like some people are going to not have that capacity as well because
right.
of their own lack of nurturing or abuse early in life that can be impacted. But generally, it's part of the human condition.
Yeah, and you know, like, I mean, there's self-compassion and compassion for, um, like that allows you then to um, maybe tolerate your shame and guilt more and not need to then just blame and project.
Right, right. And that's, you know, this, I think part of that self compassion is if people recognize, like, why, how we were reared, you know, in terms of education and in our culture,
Mhm.
that it doesn't sort of let us off, but it makes sense of it. So I,
Right.
I think there's some
Get out of a
compassion
blame
there.
mentality, you know, and just try to understand.
Right, right. Um, so then the next was this idea of passivity and avoidance versus speaking up and taking action. And I think the patient that you mentioned, that's a good example of someone that's like has this feeling like I can't let this stand because otherwise I'm participating in it to not speak up. Um, and then that leads us to the courage piece is people might be avoiding because of all the reasons we talked about, but they also might be fearful of the collective, what are people going to say if I speak up? Or
Right, and with this person, and I think this can often be the case, that he was close to this person, and it's a loss to have this person have
right.
such a different way of thinking about things, and what'll happen if he speaks up and this person then feels angry at him, or that it's a risk.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
Right. And to enter any of those kind of conversations, there's a vulnerability to,
right.
and so if that's just sort of accepted, like this is going to be uncomfortable, this is going to,
Right, that there's not a way to make it comfortable and that it's okay that it's uncomfortable. Some stuff is uncomfortable.
right, right,
It goes with the territory, but it's better to um, wade into those uncomfortable waters than to avoid that. I mean, sometimes it can give you self-esteem to bear the discomfort because it's like the right thing to do.
right, right. And who knows, even if not going into the conversation with an intention of changing someone's mind, just by, going in, like you said, with that curious, open mind, an open heart approach, um, then it does allow the other person to maybe open their mind too, to the other person's perspective, which doesn't happen if we come into an encounter with an agenda of we're going to make something happen or we're going to change somebody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard not to want to. But I mean, generally, like coming from a place of self-righteousness doesn't really further things.
Right. Right. Um, you had asked before we spoke about this. We were talking about courage and like where do we find courage?
Yeah.
Um, and I think I find it from being inspired by others who are taking risks and being okay with their own vulnerability. And I'm inspired by people that can say they don't know, that they, do you know what I mean? They don't have all the answers.
For me, I get a lot of help from prayer, like just like asking for strength and asking for courage, like asking for help.
Right,
I
right.
can't do it all by myself. So I like what you said about feeling inspired because I think that does also, I also am motivated in that way, but I also find courage through like spiritual practice.
Right, like anything to kind of tap into even the higher self. Like, how can I bring my highest self to this um, conversation or this issue or this situation?
Right, because the highest self is like so tuned into that love vibration, which is like the opposite of racism.
Right, right. So, is there what have we not? I mean, obviously, there's a lot we haven't covered, but I'm just flipping through. Um, Anything else that you want to add?
Well, I mean, I am heartened by the fact that this is not any longer like an issue that only like Black people are marching and protesting, that there is increased consciousness in the society, particularly among the young people, and that we don't want to be like this, or at least a lot of us don't, and that it's a lot of different kinds of people are now coming together to protest and to express like a wish for a different world, and that's good.
Right. So it can be like activism can be at the level of having one of those difficult conversations, or it can be at the level of marching in the streets. It can be at the level of voting.
Mhm. There's many different ways that a person can
Right.
be part of the solution.
And it can be tapping into whatever someone's own unique abilities are. And so there's not one way
Right,
for everybody.
right. Like one way for us is like doing this conversation.
Right. And I mean, I hope that because what we're talking about is, we're talking about like what we're trying to do for ourselves. So I do hope that other people see considering and thinking about these things as worthy endeavor to like really dig deep into our own participation in all of this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to hold a vision for a different kind of more just world.
Right, right. So I so since we haven't done this before, I guess we just sign off and we look forward to our next discussion. And we don't know yet what that will be, but we'll hope this was helpful to someone out there.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, Judy.
Right.
Take care. Bye bye.